I'm Susie. This is my podcast. It's been a little while since I've posted anything. You know, life, it goes on. I keep saying this. I mean, I feel like every pod, I'm like, it's been a minute because life. So I suppose that goes without saying to some extent. Be that as it may, here I am again. I once again have things to say, and very brief kind of prelude is that I'm recording on a Saturday morning. It's quiet in my house and I have the door open. It's late summer and the sounds of late summer and woods are very soothing to me. And so I'm going to leave that happening in the background and I hope it isn't too distracting. So, without further ado, man, there's been a ton of stuff happening in the world. I don't want to seem alarmist or melodramatic, but it does feel like a unique moment in the history of the US. And for me, it's really hard not to see this moment within the context of our history as a nation. It feels like a massive culmination of a long chain of events that we've all been sort of watching in horror over the last few years and arguably well beyond that. The most notable and historically significant series of events must be proclaimed to be the now multiple prosecutions of the former president. This, more than any of the other weighty and historically anomalous issues that face us, speaks to the future of our democratic society. You can probably see why I begin with a qualifier to mitigate against a perception of conspiracy or hysteria. I would like this to be heard as a modestly impartial assessment about the frailty of the democratic experiment that we have so long taken for granted. So today I'm going to talk about why I think it's important to listen to our better angels, as Abraham Lincoln would have it. I want to talk about why the quality of aspiration towards enlightenment and the collective betterment of our people is a worthy thing to pursue. And I want to talk about how the barriers that are often put up to prevent us from seeking the heights that we deserve are not insurmountable. In short, I submit to you an argument for idealism, unblemished by cynicism that masquerades as pragmatism. I stake a claim against pessimism that allows us to gradually lower ourselves to our basest instincts and clamor over our most selfish desires. I hope you'll hear me out, and I hope that it will in some small way inspire you to allow yourself to aim higher in our politics, in our communities, and in our personal growth as individuals. If nothing else, I hope to remind my fellow citizens of the noble principles of our nation and to point out that we've never properly honored them to their fullest and most honest realization. That means there's still work to be done, and we all have a part to play in it. I expect that almost all Americans agree to one degree or another that we hold a unique position in the world based solely on our form of democratic governance, even if only for the constant diet of American exceptionalism propaganda that we've been subjected to for our entire lives. But most people, I expect, know and understand that a Republican democracy differs from a pure democracy because of its representative nature. We have elected leaders, we vote for them every so often, and they make decisions on behalf of their constituents. When we think of democracy, we often think of the Greeks, who it's thought largely originated the ideas of democratic governance. But even among the Greeks, there were disagreements about who should be able to participate. The Greek culture was deeply steeped in patriarchal institutions, and it was largely agreed that free men of a certain class and over a certain age were the only citizens qualified to participate in that democracy. Plato in the Republic discusses his many reasons for believing that to be the highest and best form of social order, but it boils down to some people are just intrinsically better and smarter than others, and they should therefore be in charge of everything for everyone's benefit. And I think to our modern eyes, that looks like utter hogwash for the most part, but it is nevertheless the core principle at the center of the idea of American democracy. First institutionalized in our nation with the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution and by the total omission of even the mention of women as recognized entities. The only legitimate actors in the American political process were white landowning men. However, woven into the total tapestry, along with patriarchal strictures that marginalize would-be citizens, there's a healthy dose of Enlightenment philosophy. I've spoken about this a bit before, but some of the philosophers who deeply influenced many of the men who formed the Continental Congress were exploring ideas that were complete paradigm shifts from the imperialistic or authoritarian monarchic institutions that comprise the world's greatest powers. People like Adam Smith, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and David Hume. Smith is historically regarded as the father of modern capitalism, and his work forms the basis of an enormous amount of modern economics. But he wasn't an economist. I'm not entirely sure that was even a thing when he was alive. He was a moral philosopher. He wrote about how the collection and the distribution of wealth in societal structures was based on moral principles, or should be based on moral principles. He argued for objective recognition of the individual value of each person, and he reasoned that societies should aspire to the collective success of all of a community's constituents. It's pretty heady stuff. Rousseau's work focuses on social dynamics and the tension between freedom and social dependencies. Quoting here, as I have before and will no doubt again, from the Stanford University's very excellent philosophy department's website, he explores, quote, constructing institutions that permit and foster the coexistence of free and equal citizens in a community where they themselves are sovereign, end quote. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher about whom I've spoken in prior pod episodes. I have a distinctive admiration for Hume because I identify so much with his thinking. He was a strong and vociferous atheist, and he adamantly rejected organized religion in all its forms. I'm neither of those things in the extreme, but I lean in that direction, and I appreciate that he stood firm on the strength of his convictions, though it had such a detrimental effect on his life. He never once held an academic post in his whole life, more or less because of those personal beliefs. The resultant concerns about his potential in an academic position, as with Socrates before him, but with rather less severe circumstances, were that his beliefs, as presented in his work, would undoubtedly pollute the minds of the youth, and he was subsequently shunned professionally throughout his life. Yet, his work was singularly influential in history. He's like the philosophy version of Van Gogh. Though, upon a moment's reflection, there's a whole bunch of stories like Hume's in the history of philosophy. It's a lonely vocation. In any event, Hume explored human nature, and he did so on the principles of natural philosophy, which is the precursor to what we today would call scientific principles. His ideas on moral philosophy and cognitive processes together formulate an entirely new way of thinking about how a person manifests their own destiny. That particular shift in thinking influenced what would later be named the scientific method in the 19th century. Natural philosophy formed the foundation of principles explored by Enlightenment thinkers and broke focus away from dogmatic thinking, shifting it towards the faithful observance of systematic empirical techniques. And from this, a collective society can have a place of common trust and understanding. In that environment, truth is founded in the trust of authoritative expertise based on scientific knowledge. That then becomes a bedrock in a democracy because it represents the mechanism by which citizens are informed about their own governance and then defines their action in that governance. A specific example of something like this is the Nuremberg Codes defining ethical medical testing. During World War II, as the name suggests, it was discovered that the Nazis were performing horrific medical experiments throughout their concentration camps. Ostensibly, their justification for these atrocities was that, like Benjamin Franklin, who robbed graves and paid for fresh corpses to further anatomical knowledge, the Nazis used their eugenics-based ideals that the, quote, broken people in the world, who represented the lesser races, could be used to develop medical techniques to improve the lives of the superior races. The result in the international scientific community and medical community, however, was to create ethics-based medical testing guidelines that don't allow spurious political or ideological principles to permeate the strictures of scientific inquiry. In other words, the world created a means by which scientific authority can check the power of a political institution or movement. All the Enlightenment thinkers created a dialogue around one central principle: the power of the individual and the collective power of individuals over the church or the state. And this is a reality that correlates directly from the Protestant Reformation that totally reshaped the world. The Protestant Reformation was, in essence, a democratization of faith. And once you open the door to a person believing that they can have a personal relationship with divinity, that completely transforms a person's idea of personal power. Combined with revolutionary ideas about what could be possible if we follow those ideas to their fullest potential, you have a powerful manifestation of collective social progress. And from that sort of, declarative act as embodied in the Declaration of Independence, the Pandora's box of full humanity bursts forth. Much of the fallout from that gathered and coalesced into the American experiment. The balance of ideals against the backdrop of pragmatic needs of governance form a particular kind of quandary in the world. And that's why we can't take it for granted. There are no guarantees that it will continue to work, and it definitely doesn't work on its own. It requires active and exhaustive participation. Why is it so hard to act from a position of idealism as an individual? There's a lot of evidence that the way we formulate our beliefs is not based on a vacuum of individual accumulation of knowledge and evidence, but as a social framework. There are studies that show us individuals will often act in ways that are demonstrably counter to their direct interests if they believe that is the will of their common in-group. And think of an in-group as like a person's tribe. It's the group of people with whom you most identify and to whom you best connect. A psychologist named Todd Rose wrote an excellent book called Collective Illusions. Among many of the fascinating studies that he cites in this book, two stand out to me as particularly revealing. One is a survey of people who, when asked what they think the most important goal is for people, over 90% of the people responded that fame was the number one priority for most people. However, over 90% of the people surveyed also ranked fame as dead last on their own rank of priorities. The other is a study of sports fans who, when hooked up to a brain scan, showed increased activity in certain parts of the brain associated with gratification and an increase in dopamine production when their team performed a positive action. But they demonstrated that same activity, and very often heightened activity, when their team's rival performed a negative action. And I think these results in aggregate tell us something really important about the position of socialization on our view of the world. And I think it can provide us with some important context for understanding how and why our collective decisions as a society can be so deeply flawed and can present us a particular sort of danger to democracy. A pitfall of acting collectively based on a social idea is excellently demonstrated in prohibition, a constitutional amendment at one point prohibiting the manufacture and purchase of alcohol in the United States. At its core, prohibition presented prescriptive governance that limits a person's right to choose, which is antithetical to the ideals of freedom, but does adhere to particular religious views that then were formulated into a practical social argument. And here's what I mean by that. Prohibition was first and best promoted by temperance leagues, which were predominantly formed of women and extreme fundamentalist Christian activists. Their reasoning was that the regular drunkenness of American men, a very real problem at the time, resulted in rampant domestic abuse and women and children who were totally dependent upon men being neglected or left to fend for themselves, falling into poverty, sickness, and early deaths. The temperance leagues and suffragettes were in close association because their interests were the interests of women. They argued that if women were given the vote, they would be a force in democracy that could right many of these wrongs through strong policy that empowered women to make decisions about their own lives. But that was a bridge too far, really. So they all decided the thing to do was just make everyone stop drinking. And we know how that ended. They had to repeal that amendment in the form of another amendment to the Constitution. Do you know how hard it is to pass an amendment to the Constitution? It's really hard. They did it twice on this one thing. And in its wake, it established a powerful organized crime organization that plagued the nation for decades through consequences such as all but destroying the integrity and power of labor unions and corrupting the structures of money and politics in ways that we wrestle with today. And I think one of the main reasons prohibition failed so completely was because it was based on flawed ideology, as Dr. Jason Stanley describes it. Prohibition initially coalesced around the idea that before spirits bedeviled these men, they were kind and caring providers. It whitewashed the conditions of American families and the domain of patriarchy by appealing to an imagined ideal that never really existed. Idealism that looks backwards is merely nostalgia. It's a house of cards that's doomed to fall at the slightest breeze. Another way idealism fails us is the tendency towards lionization of heroes. This isn't a specific American problem, but as per usual, we do it bigger and better. It's really a universal human thing, but our awareness of it does not seem to inhibit its formation, nor the inevitable backlash against positions of criticism as heresy against the established order. I think the best way to illuminate this is the examination of the flaws of the Enlightenment thinkers and those influenced by them. Here's a handful. David Hume was a renowned asshole, and people did not like him at all, and not just because he held unpopular views. He was an intense racist, and I expect equally misogynistic, but I don't know for sure. Thomas Jefferson had slaves his whole life, though he privately confessed to believing slavery was morally wrong and an abomination. He could have freed them at any time, but he kept them all his life, and maybe even raped and impregnated one of them. Alexander Hamilton had affairs, and at least one of them also involved extortion. He also shot and killed his main political rival in a duel. Abraham Lincoln wanted to send all Black people in America to Africa to form their own country, but only after they finished fighting and dying for the Union in the Civil War. Understanding and acknowledging the human flaws of foundational thinkers does not necessarily weaken the power of their ideas, much in the same way that the abhorrent actions of an artist does not necessarily negate the value of their expression or the cultural impact of their work. Look at Pablo Picasso, for an example. What a shitheel. But in an environment where dissent to institutional norms is seen as a threat, then nothing can be so damaging as critique of a hero. There are currently legislative actions being undertaken in some states to prohibit information like the stuff I'm talking about here from being known or taught in schools and colleges. It's presented under a rubric of American patriotism and an effort to uphold only the pure democratic principles of our nation by upholding our founders up as apostles of truth and righteousness. But it actually represents the very opposite by shutting down dissent. The act of calling out these contradictions and vocally encouraging others not to allow a false narrative to prevail is generally described as cancellation these days. And it can take on a particularly vicious and angry tone that makes it appear as an effort to silence. But cancellation isn't censorship. It's a demand for accountability and change. That's not to say it's always done well, but even when it is, patriarchy doesn't understand this idea because it's accustomed to making the rules, not having to play by them. Arthur Murray is an historian, no relation to the dance guy as far as I know, who coined the term boomerang moralism, which is the measuring of historical figures by the standards they themselves helped create. And this is often used as the counterpoint to criticisms of establishment figures. You can't measure a historical figure's actions or notions by today's standards. They must be properly contextualized by their own times. I think that totally misses the point, though. First, it ignores the fact that opposition views did in fact exist at the time those positions were held, and so it implies that the subject would not have necessarily known or been influenced by an opposing view. But more insidiously, it negates the value of challenging the position itself as mere rabble-rousing. By challenging the lionized position of heroes, we point to the fact that their ideals have not yet been realized, even by the person who first pointed them out. So, going back to Dr. Rose's work in Collective Illusions, and along with this lionization problem, we confront what I call the problem of electability. This is the process whereby each voting citizen, when evaluating a candidate, must evaluate how much weight or influence their vote may have due to whether the candidate that they support is electable or not. This is a calculus a citizen should not have to perform. And as the two studies I pointed out illustrate quite neatly, this process leans in on principles of collective illusion or even mass delusion. If a voter believes the majority of their party supports a candidate, even though it is only a very vocal minority, that person's more likely to vote for that candidate, whom they may dislike very much, merely to avoid social isolation. The instinct is that powerful that it can influence a person to either openly subscribe or silently consent to something that they themselves do not believe. In this moment, Trump is shouting as loudly and as often as he can that he is being persecuted by his political opposition. For his most ardent supporters, the claim of persecution easily takes root because acceptance of the conclusion of a legitimate prosecution and a fair conviction points to some existential uncertainty that people will tend to avoid. But it also depends upon the social dynamics that have been an undercurrent of Trump's entire political career. Those social dynamics most closely resemble those of a cult, but they manifest as a political movement, which is very weird. We haven't really seen anything like that before. Like, there was a little bit of it when the Tea Party was having its moment, but nothing like this. I'm not impartial. I expect that's abundantly clear. However, I do share the excellent quality of human intellect afforded by a well-developed cerebral cortex that empowers me with the ability to isolate my emotional or moral reactions and set them to the side to better identify the evidence before me. The evidence available to us publicly right now tells us this: Donald Trump is not being politically persecuted for imagined crimes. He is being criminally prosecuted for actual crimes, many of which all American citizens bore witness to, and many other yet to be fully revealed. You can tell he's not being persecuted because he's not in jail right now. Alexei Navalny is in fact being politically persecuted, and is not only in jail right now for speaking out against Vladimir Putin's crimes, but recently had 25 years added to his sentence. That's what political persecution actually looks like. MAGA believes because they trust bad actors who are aware of the very real suffering of their believers, but who nevertheless manipulate and exploit them to progress goals that ultimately harm those very believers. But moreover, it harms the ideals of democracy itself by subverting the real self-interest of their believers and thus the principles of democratic governance. The movement towards authoritarianism in America is indeed a change in political focus. Traditional bipartisan governance is not currently in the driver's seat. Traditional conservatives, it seems to me, are being overruled and overshadowed by a dangerous political cult. In the most unsatisfactory way possible, I think the way back to idealism begins with an individual on their own terms. In the near term, I think the train has left the station and the 2024 general election will be preceded by and largely eclipsed by a campaign consumed by legal processes and political propaganda. This leads to a subversion of the actual objective of an election, which is governance. So this is why I think now is the moment to look to our ideals as a nation. I think every citizen needs to strip away their assumptions about American politics and look within themselves to understand what they themselves need to thrive and for their communities to strengthen. And most importantly, I think it's really important that we look to a principle that has been at the very center of the entire American experiment from the very beginning, which is to say, union. The union is our collective community. States comprise its constituents, but we are all governed by the same principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideals form the foundation of the entire American experiment, and they comprise the body of laws that govern our nation. And it's for that reason that I make this case for holding to higher ideals in the face of a political environment that's testing all of our institutions. The upcoming campaign season is going to be two different stories. One will be a pretty traditional presidential campaign by an incumbent president talking about issues and legislation that was passed during his administration. And the other will be in multiple courtrooms and in the galaxy of disingenuous punditry. The total lack of parity in that race challenges the nature of our political processes in really important ways. So it's just critically important for us all to go back to the basics of democracy and make the choices that take us back to our core principles. If it's the sort of thing you're into, please go and read Dr. Rose's excellent book, Collective Illusions. It's extremely enlightening. And if you can stomach it, encourage the people in your life to search themselves for what's most important in their lives and to formulate their political views based on that instead of whatever noise or political claptrap is polluting their sphere of knowledge. Encourage them to seek information from many sources and trust their gut on what's really true. But mostly in yourself, trust what matters to you is important. In fact, it's probably just as important to everybody else. 2024 is going to be a circus of the American horror story variety, and we're all going to have to buckle up and ride it out together. But I think the fact that we got here is a sign that things are working in democratic terms. Americans in aggregate are never going to lay down to a dictator. I think you can take that to the bank.